Good morning, and welcome to Neighborhood Unitarian Universalist Church here in Pasadena, California. Welcome to all members, friends, and guests here. Well, actually, we're virtual today. Neighborhood Church creates and grows an inclusive community of faith connected by love, spirit, and service. My name is James Coombs, and I am honored to serve as a member of your Board of Trustees. Thank you for joining us as we continue to prioritize connection over perfection in this online service to protect the health and well-being of our members and friends, and which we are recording for future viewing. We will continuously learn to adapt and create joyful opportunities to be together while keeping our community safe. Today's service is led by the Reverend Dr. Teresa Cooley and Dr. Zenaida Robles and features the wonderful music of Wes Lang. Neighborhood Church upholds a covenant of right relations with one another. Today, we focus on the portion through which we covenant to engage one another in shared ministry through our daily interactions. We listen appreciatively, being mindful, present, and respectful, assuming good intentions, and seeking to understand one another. We aspire to resolve conflict in a loving, compassionate way and to forgive each other out of generosity of spirit. In these times, with COVID forcing us to change our natural patterns and rhythms, it is more important than ever for us to remain mindful and engaged to support this community and to support each other. There are many ways to connect with our church community throughout the week, both in person and virtually. Whether you're new or ready to find new ways to engage, please visit our website and social media to learn more. Here are a few ways to connect. Starting this week, the Governance Work Group is hosting 6 listening sessions to gather input and explore how we all want to work together in the decision-making for our congregation. We are building on the work of the transition team and the 8th Principle Work Group and hope that you will sign up to join us for these sessions. Please see this week's newsletter for more information on how to sign up. Each Sunday, our congregation expands our impact by dedicating 100% of contributions to local social justice efforts. This week, the Share the Plate Committee has chosen for our gifts to fund Neighborhood Church's own social justice and inclusion, outreach, and education work. We invite you to give to our internal projects that engage in mindful advocacy and action in tune with the earth and all of its inhabitants, because we believe in creating a more equitable, just, and peaceful world. There are many opportunities for us to put our Unitarian Universalist principles in action at Neighborhood. Some of us participate in phone banks or write letters to support voting or human rights campaigns. Some of us volunteer at cold weather shelters, make sandwiches for Union Station, or deliver flowers from this year's Rose Parade. Many congregants support foster children and families through our back to school and other opportunities. One very popular activity is traveling to Tijuana with Esperanza to help build homes, which we hope will come back soon. These activities and more represent our moral and financial commitments to support this important work internally as well as in the world. Thank you for giving generously through our website or text to give. We look forward to working together in 2022 towards justice. Again, welcome to Neighborhood Church, whoever you are and wherever you are on your spiritual journey. Welcome to this inclusive faith community connected by love, spirit, and service.
I'm so glad that you all have joined us online. And as depressing as it is that we cannot be together, James and I just heard bird song through the door, so that's a sign for me that we are going to be at a new place sometime soon. We arrive, each of us jostled and distracted, trailing clouds of days of grief and fear. We come to center ourselves once more, to touch again that place inside where we are most at home with who we have become, to find once more that place of calm where we're not isolated from each other. We come to reweave the unraveling fabric of community, to reconnect once more with the larger human family, to remind ourselves that we belong, and to remember what it is we belong to. We come to reaffirm those values which we would have find our way into our lives and our relationships, to choose again our better selves and the ways we know of peace and gentleness and joy. Come, let us worship together.
Good morning. Our opening hymn is number 89 in the gray hymnal, Come My Way, My Truth, My Life. Please join me in singing.
Each Sunday, our congregation expands our impact by dedicating 100% of our contributions to local social justice efforts. As mentioned, this week's Share the Plate Committee has chosen for our gifts to fund neighborhood churches' own social justice, inclusion, and outreach and education work. We invite you to give to our internal projects that engage in mindful advocacy and action in tune with the earth and all of its inhabitants, because we believe in creating a more equitable, just, and peaceful world. Information should be posted on your screen now as to how to give.
the ever-creative wells. Thank you so much for that. Let us join in the spirit of prayer, of meditation, of reflection. Recognizing that there are many ways to know and name that which is sacred and holy, let us focus our attention toward an inner place of peace and prayer. O thou in whom there is harmony, source of all good, we come with our thanksgiving and prayers. Receive the confessions which we must needs make, each one silently, for wasted moments and bitter words and untrusting thoughts, for bad tempers, meanness, and insincerities, and for all of our daily failures to live our best life in Thee. Take us out of the loneliness of self and fill us with the fullness of truth and love. We have loved, but perhaps not enough. We have sought, but perhaps not diligently. We have seen, but perhaps not perceived. We have hoped for things heavenly, but often cling to things earthly. Help us to rise above our weaknesses and fears, to be the guide of our minds and the strength of our wills, that in simplicity and steadfastness we may do our daily work, and in patience and quietness meet our daily cares. Let the still small voice speaking in our inmost conscience whisper that the time has come to not be as the past, but that by finding, perceiving, understanding, and loving, we may yet have rest and joy undisturbed forevermore. Amen. Our reading this morning is from the Book of Forgiving by the late and wonderful Archbishop Desmond Tutu and his daughter Mfo Tutu. They say forgiveness is not dependent on the actions of others. Yes, it is certainly easier to offer forgiveness when the perpetrator expresses remorse and offers some sort of reparation or restitution. Then you can feel as if you have been paid back in some way. You can say, I'm willing to forgive for stealing my pen, and after you give my pen back, I shall forgive you. This is the most familiar pattern of forgiveness. In this understanding, forgiveness is something that we offer to another, a gift that we bestow upon someone, but it is a gift that has strings attached. The problem is that the strings we attach to the gift of forgiveness become the chains that bind us to the person who harmed us. Those are chains to which the perpetrator holds the key. We may set the conditions for granting our forgiveness, but the person who harmed us decides whether or not the conditions are too onerous to fulfill. We continue to be that person's victim. I'll not speak to you until you say you are sorry, my young granddaughter, Annalena, will rage. Her older sister, thinking the demand unfair and unjustified, refuses to apologize, and so the two remain locked in a battle of wills, bound by mutual resentment. There are two routes out of this impasse. The older Nioniso can apologize, or Annalena can decide to forgo the apology and forgive unconditionally. Unconditional forgiveness is a different model of forgiveness than the gift with strings. This is forgiveness as a grace, a free gift freely given. In this model, forgiveness frees the person who inflicted the harm from the weight of the victim's whim, what the victim may demand in order to grant forgiveness, and the victim's threat of vengeance. But it also frees the one who forgives, the one who offers forgiveness as a grace, is immediately untethered from the yoke that bound him or her to the person who caused the harm. When you forgive, you are free to move on in life, to grow, to no longer be a victim. When you forgive, you slip the yoke, and your future is unshackled from your past. And now Wells and Dr. Robles and I will do the dialogue hymn that's in our teal hymnal. It's too difficult to figure out how to put on slides, so I invite you just to close your eyes and listen. For each time that our fears have made us rigid and inaccessible.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For each time we have struck out in anger without just cause.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For each time that our greed has blinded us to the needs of others.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For the selfishness that sets us apart and alone.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For falling short of the admonitions of the Spirit.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For losing sight of our unity.
We forgive ourselves ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
For those and for so many acts, both evident and subtle, which have fueled the illusion of separateness.
We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love.
Thank you. The passing of Archbishop Desmond Tutu hit me hard a few weeks ago when I first learned of it. I've long been fascinated with South Africa and the way in which they seem to overcome a polarization far more extreme than what we are now experiencing. And I know that Archbishop Tutu played a huge role in the transformation of that country. But he also played a very big role in transforming my understanding of this challenging topic of forgiveness, which he and his daughter, as I read in the reading, the Reverend Mfo Tutu, discuss in the book that I quoted from. I've been fascinated by this concept of forgiveness for years, not necessarily because it's so hard for me to forgive, but because I often hear people toss that word around as though it is something that is relatively simple. And of course it isn't. I think that we most often hear it from people who do think it's simple when they want someone else to forgive, not necessarily describing their own forgiveness. When I was still a ministerial student, I attended a workshop on the subject of forgiveness at our General Assembly with some of our finest theologians as panelists. Each one was asked the question, is true forgiveness possible? And the last one to speak, the late Jack Taylor, had the most honest answer of all. Damned if I know, he said. But then he went on to say that forgiveness is not an act of will. It is an act of grace. And we heard that echoed in the work of the Tutus. The idea that it's an act of grace has stayed with me all these years later. And it left me with the sense that I was never going to fully wrestle this concept to the ground, and it would continue to speak to me in different ways throughout the years. More recently, you hear about forgiveness in the context of the Me Too movement, or in conversations about people of color who are horrifically harmed by white racism. And sometimes we'll hear, where is forgiveness? Over and over again. When are they ever going to get over it? I admit to a great deal of anger when I hear it bandied about this way, because what does it do? It puts the burden once again on the person who's abused. Before any real acknowledgement of the harm, before any attempts at atonement, before any apology even. But as I said before, what bothers me most about these calls for forgiveness is they come from people who actually haven't been harmed themselves. So let me say this clearly, the only one who can offer true forgiveness is the one most harmed. But when I read the book of Forgiving, it made me think about forgiveness a little differently. Not just in terms of what it gives to the abuser, but what it offers to the one who has been abused. They tell story after story about people who've been horrifically harmed. People who've been dealt terrible blows, literal and figurative. And yet all of their stories are about their lives being transformed by forgiveness. The Tutus are quick to say what forgiveness is not, that forgiving doesn't mean forgetting the harm. It doesn't mean denying the harm. It doesn't mean pretending that it didn't happen, or that the injury wasn't perhaps as bad as it really was. All of these are what we call cheap grace. But quite the opposite is true. True forgiveness can come only when the harm is named and when the extent of the injury is told. It may or may not involve reconciliation with the perpetrator, but at some point, there is a decision made to not let one's life be forever consumed by the harm that has been done. As the Tutus say, without forgiveness, we remain tethered to the person who harmed us. We're bound with chains of bitterness, tied together, trapped. Until we can forgive the person who harmed us, that person will hold the keys to our happiness. That person will be our jailer. When we forgive, we take back control of our own fate and feelings. We become our own liberators. We don't forgive to help the other person. We don't forgive for others. We forgive for ourselves and our own self-interest, our own liberation, spiritually and scientifically. A few years back, I read an article written by the journalist Deborah Copacan, who had a huge epiphany when she was watching the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. Deborah Copacan had a horrific experience of being raped the night before her college graduation in 1988. I won't go into details, but she tried to report it the day after, and she was told that she really wouldn't be believed and she should just get on with her life. And she did, burying this incredibly painful experience and becoming a very successful photojournalist. But she continued to be haunted by that horrific harm. So when she saw Dr. Ford being blamed for her experience, her outrage exploded. Without thinking too much about it, she sat down and wrote an email to her rapist, whom she continued to know, telling him of her experience that night and all the ways he damaged her physically, mentally, spiritually. And within 20 minutes, her phone rang. It was her rapist saying the most important words she had ever thought she would hear. He said, "Oh my God, I am so sorry. I'm so sorry." He was blacked out drunk, and so he does not remember this experience, but he also never used that as an excuse. Instead, in the most gentle way possible, he asked her to tell him her story. And she did. And he listened, and he pledged to find some way to pay forward the great debt that he now knew he owed. And Deborah Copacan felt freer than she had ever felt in her life. In this story, we see all the elements that the Tutus say create the opportunity for real forgiveness. They describe it as a fourfold path: telling the story, naming the hurt, granting forgiveness, and either renewing or releasing the relationship. Each of these steps is probably worthy of a sermon in and of themselves, but what I find so interesting is that these same 4 steps apply whether you're trying to forgive someone or if you're the one who needs or wants forgiveness. If you're asking for forgiveness, you need to listen to the story without defensiveness, to be able to name the hurt that you know you have perpetuated, to ask humbly for forgiveness, knowing it may or may not be granted, to pledge yourself to rebuilding the relationship if that is offered. The other night, I was talking with an old friend of mine who reminded me about an experience I had with this complicated concept of forgiveness. It was about another former friend of mine whom I'd been quite close to at one time. He was someone who was always the life of the party, quick with a witty retort and a quirky way of looking at things. But when this friend started drinking, which he did in increasingly uncontrolled ways, his wit became cruel. In the hard light of day, he was always apologetic and was constantly asking me for forgiveness. And mostly, I granted it because he seemed to be legitimately repentant in those times. But then his cruelty escalated, and so I finally put an end to the relationship. Many years later, he contacted me out of the blue and he asked me to meet with him. He'd been in recovery for his alcoholism, and he wanted to offer his amends to me. I was actually really excited to meet him, to talk about this, because I was hoping to see the friend who I first became fond of. When we met, he immediately went into what felt like a memorized speech, bringing up all the harmful things that he had done to me in a way that reawakens the original trauma. And he seemed unconcerned that I was growing more and more distressed. And he also offered to me, "You can tell me more about the ways I hurt you." That was really not the conversation I expected or wanted to have. And then I realized it was still all about him. He was doing the prescribed thing without any sense that it had really pierced his consciousness or his conscience, and without ever listening to me. One of those essential elements that the tutus talk about. And so for weeks after this conversation, I replayed this trauma over and over again until this friend who I talked to the other night intervened with her wisdom. She said, "Did you really expect that he would have changed? In fact, he was being the person he always had been. You just hadn't been willing to see it in the beginning." And this reminded me of the wisdom of another friend that you've heard me say before. I trust everyone. I just trust them to be themselves. All of this made me realize that I had been trying all along to fix him by constantly offering him what I now see as cheap grace. I was offering him a path to continue to wound me. But what my other friend helped me to see was that I was still attached to the fantasy that I could help him. And so I realized I had my own work to do on ways in which I could be codependent. I needed to think about my relationships differently and reckon with ways in which I could be controlling as well. And when I started concentrating on my own work, my pain and resentment of him faded away. And I finally felt free of the burden of that relationship and found a way to the grace of true forgiveness. Because ultimately, and this is the hardest part of the message that the tutus try to impart, they say, in our own ways, we are all broken. Out of that brokenness, we hurt others. Forgiveness is the journey we take toward healing the broken parts. It is how we become whole again. Not just whole within ourselves, but whole within humanity. Henry Wordsworth Longfellow said, "If we could read the secret history of our enemies, We should find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. When we have hatred for others, we carry that hatred in our own hearts, and it harms us even more. We are created for fellowship. We are created to form the human family, existing together because we are made for one another. We're not made for exclusivity or self-sufficiency, but for interdependence. We break this essential law at our peril. We take care of our world by taking care of each other. Again, from the Tutus. Ultimately, forgiveness is a choice that we make. And the ability to forgive others comes from the recognition that we are all flawed. We are all human. We have all made mistakes and harmed others, and we will again. Forgiveness must take its own time, and there is no set prescription. It won't always be possible to follow that fourfold path, and it is not for us to demand it of others. But I have to have faith that in spite of knowing this, at some point we must still seek to build a kind of new life in which we have all learned better the value of love and peace and respect. We're all probably aware of that searing photograph of a young girl burned by napalm during the Vietnam War, running down the street, ripping the clothing from her body. Her vulnerability and pain helped the world see what the war was inflicting on so many, and I believe helped turn the tide against the war. Much later, as a young woman and mother, she visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and she placed a wreath on it and said, "If I could talk face to face with the pilot who dropped these bombs, I would tell him we cannot change the past, but we should try to do good things for the present and the future to promote peace." And she said, "I forgive, I forgive." So back to Jack Taylor, forgiveness is not an act of will, it is an act of grace. It cannot be forced upon another. We cannot even force it within ourselves. But when we let the grace of our commitment to a way of living without hatred free us, a new kind of liberation can be found. Amen. May it be so.
Please join me in singing our closing hymn, number 131, Love Will Guide Us.
Love will guide us, peace has tried us, hope inside us will lead the way on the road from
You may have seen in your Sunday email or in the newsletter that Ginger Fury is going to offer an opportunity for you to engage in a dialogue about the service this morning. So the Zoom link for that is in your newsletter, and if you don't have the newsletter, you can email Angeline at ajackson@neighborhooduu.org, and she will happily provide you the link for that conversation. We have great depths within us, which we have never plumbed. Great insight and intuition, great reservoirs of love. The path to them leads through places of emptiness and fear. Let us pray for courage and perseverance as we seek the treasure of our own hidden places, of the faith and the trust and the hope that lie there. May we learn the wisdom that begins with ourselves. Amen.